He had not been back in 12 years. The highway stretched out the same as he remembered it, 2 lanes of cracked asphalt cutting through nothing in particular, the kind of road that people only drove because they had to. Marcus Webb had not had to drive it in over a decade. He owned 3 planes. He had a driver in Atlanta and 1 in Chicago, and a car service on retainer in 4 cities. He had not needed to drive himself anywhere in years. And yet, on a Tuesday morning in November, with a board meeting postponed and his assistant politely baffled, he had climbed into the back of his own town car, told the driver to bring him to Decatur, and then, somewhere around Macon, asked the man to pull over and switch seats. He needed to drive the last stretch himself. He could not have explained why. The Starlight Gas and Grocery sat at the intersection of Route 41 and a county road that went nowhere worth noting. It had a faded yellow awning that Marcus had watched bleach through 3 shades over the course of 2 years. The pumps were new, he noticed. The canopy had been patched. The sign was the same hand-painted plywood letters, though, and the bell above the door still gave that thin, tinny ring when you pushed it open. He knew because he stood in the parking lot for 2 full minutes before he walked in. Inside, the smell was exactly what it had always been. Coffee held too long on a burner, motor oil layered under something sweet, the same wire rack of chips near the door, the same coolers running along the back wall with the hum that was just a little too loud for the size of the room. Marcus stood at the threshold and breathed it in, and for a moment he was 22 years old again, and it was not a good feeling. The woman behind the counter looked up. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She wore a navy vest with the Starlight logo over a white tee, and she had the look of someone who had been on her feet since 6 in the morning and expected to stay there until 6 in the evening. She gave him the standard gas station welcome, neutral and efficient. "Morning, pumps are working, coffee's fresh. Anything I can help you find?" Marcus took off his coat. He folded it over his arm. He said, "I'm looking for Earl Benton." She studied him for a moment. "Earl passed 3 years ago." Marcus stood with that for a second. He had not known. He had not expected to know, and the not knowing still landed somewhere in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said. He meant it. "You a friend of his?" "I used to work here," Marcus said. "A long time ago." She took her glasses off her forehead and set them on the counter. She looked at him differently now, the way people do when they are recalibrating. "Work here," she repeated. 12 years ago. He let me go. I came back to see why." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You came 200 miles to ask a dead man why he fired you?" Marcus almost smiled. "Not exactly," he said. He asked if he could buy a cup of coffee. She said he could. He poured it himself, the same way he had for 2 years of morning shifts, from the left carafe because the right one always burned a little hot. She noticed that. He could tell she noticed. Her name was Denise. Denise Benton. Earl's daughter. She had taken over the station when her father got sick, and she had kept it running alone for the past 3 years since he passed, with 2 part-time employees and a mechanic named Terrell who came in on weekends. The station was not doing poorly. It was not doing well. It existed, which is what most small things do, and she was too proud to ask for anything and too tired to pretend she was not tired. She told him none of this directly. Marcus heard it in the edges. He sat at the small table near the window, the same table where he used to eat his lunch during split shifts, and he drank the coffee. And after a while, Denise came around the counter and sat across from him because the morning rush was over, and she was curious. And curiosity had always been stronger in her than caution. "So, what do you actually want to know?" she said. He told her the truth. He said that 12 years ago, her father had called him into the back office on a Thursday afternoon and handed him his last check and told him it was not working out. 2 years of perfect attendance. No call-ins, no drawer shortages. He had trained 3 of the people Earl hired after him, and Earl had looked him in the eye and said, "I think you need to be somewhere else. Not a reason, not an apology, just a direction." I was furious, Marcus said. I was 22 and I had $41 in savings and I was furious. Denise was quiet. "I went home and I didn't leave my apartment for 3 days, he said. And then I drove to Atlanta because I had nothing better to do, and I walked into a logistics warehouse at 5 in the morning because I had heard they were hiring overnight loaders. And I did that for 8 months. And while I was doing that, I figured out that the company's routing system was losing them about $60,000 a year in fuel waste. And I wrote up how to fix it on a piece of notebook paper and gave it to the floor supervisor. And 6 weeks later, the operations director called me into his office. Denise set down her coffee cup. "The rest of it," Marcus said, "you can probably read about." She could. Web logistics had been in the news enough times over the past decade. The profile in a business magazine 3 years back, the expansion into 14 markets, the sale of the Southeast Division for figures that were public record, and that Marcus did not feel the need to recite. "So you're telling me," Denise said slowly, "that my father firing you is what started all of that?" "I'm telling you, I was a 22-year-old man who thought this job was the ceiling," Marcus said. "Your father pushed me through the ceiling. Whether he knew what he was doing, I'm not sure. That's one of the things I came to find out." Denise looked out the window at the pumps. A truck pulled in. A man in a work jacket climbed out and started filling his tank, and the familiar smell of fuel came faintly through the door. She watched him the way you watch something you have watched 1,000 times before. "He used to talk about you," she said. Marcus set down his cup. "Not often," she said, "but every now and then. He'd say, 'I let a young man go years ago, and I hope I didn't do wrong by him.' He never said your name to me. I don't know if he even remembered it. He just carried it." Marcus did not speak. "He was not a cruel man," Denise said. "He let people go when he had to, and he tried to do it with some decency. But he worried. He worried about whether he'd pushed you out for the right reasons or whether he just needed to cut costs, and told himself a story about it." "What do you think?" Marcus asked. She considered that for a long moment. "I think," she said, "that my father saw something in you that was too big for this place, and he wasn't sure if he was doing you a favour or a harm. And I think he never found out. And I think that bothered him." The man at the pumps finished and drove away. The lot was quiet again. Marcus wrapped both hands around his cup. He had built a company worth a number with many digits, and he had sat in rooms with people whose approval he had once wanted very much. And he had learned in those rooms that almost nobody in this world ever told you the plain, unvarnished truth about anything. Denise Benton had just told him the plain truth about her dead father in less than 10 minutes, and it hit him the way plain truths usually hit when you have been waiting for them a long time. "He did me a favour," Marcus said. "I know that. I knew it by the time I was 25. I just needed to come back and say thank you to someone. And he's not here." Denise looked at him steadily. "So, say it to me." He did. He said it quietly, the way men who are not in the habit of ceremony say the things that matter to them. And Denise nodded, and it was enough. They talked for another hour. She showed him the office where her father had given him that last paycheck, which was smaller now that the old metal shelving unit had been replaced with a new one, but otherwise unchanged. The same desk, the same calendar on the wall, different year, the same window looking out at the side lot where the delivery trucks came. He asked her about the station. Not in a business meeting way, but in the way you ask about a place you knew when you were still becoming yourself. She told him about the new pumps, which had cost more than she had wanted to spend, but were more efficient. She told him about the summer when the coolers failed and she had borrowed money from a cousin to replace them. She told him about the regulars, some of whom had been coming since before Marcus worked there, who came in now because their routines were 30 years deep, and a little loyalty was worth something. "It's not glamorous," she said. "No," Marcus said. "It never was. But it's ours," she said. And then she looked slightly embarrassed, as if she had said something too personal. "That's the whole thing, isn't it?" Marcus said. "That's all any of it is." He drove back to Atlanta that evening. He did not call anyone. He sat in the car as the highway unreeled itself in the dark, the same 2 lanes in reverse, and he thought about Earl Benton sitting in his office worrying about a young man whose name he might not have even remembered. Carrying a small private debt for 12 years, paid to no one, resolved by no one, just held. He thought about how many things in this world were like that, how many small acts of reckoning went unwitnessed, and how rare it was that the circle actually closed. 2 weeks later, Marcus called his CFO and his attorney. What he had in mind was not complicated, but it was specific, and he wanted it done right. He had established charitable foundations before. He knew the mechanics. This was different from a foundation. This was a direct thing, personal and particular, the way the man had been personal and particular even in his worrying. There was a small business operating grant that his company ran, aimed at independent fuel and convenience retailers in the southeast, businesses in rural or underserved corridors that were profitable enough to survive, but not liquid enough to grow or modernize without outside capital. The selection criteria were careful. The amounts were meaningful, not life-changing in the way a lottery win was life-changing, but meaningful in the way that a year without a financial emergency felt meaningful to someone who had not had that in a while. The Starlight Gas and Grocery was not automatically eligible. Marcus was not on the selection committee. He recused himself from the review of any application that came from Decatur County. He was not in the business of buying gratitude or engineering outcomes for his own satisfaction. What he did was call Denise in December and tell her the grant existed and tell her how to apply. And then he did not call her again. She applied in January. She wrote her own application, and it was plain-spoken and honest and did not oversell anything, which is exactly how a person who has been running a gas station alone for 3 years writes when they are asked to justify their own worth. The committee read it and approved it in March. The grant was $60,000, payable over 2 years, designated for infrastructure modernization and operating reserve. Denise did not know the number's history. She did not know that $60,000 was the same figure Marcus had identified in a notebook on an overnight shift in Atlanta, the same figure that had opened the first door. She did not know, and Marcus had not told her because the number was not a message. It was just the right amount, arrived at by a different route, landing in a different place, doing what it could. She called him in April to say the money had come through. She was professional about it, grateful without gushing because that is how she was. "I wanted you to know," she said. "I'm glad," he said. "Are you going to tell me you were behind this?" she said. He paused. "I flagged that the program existed," he said. "Mm-hmm," she said. There was a warmth in her voice that she was not bothering to hide, and he was glad for it, glad that she would not let him be modest about something that did not entirely deserve modesty. "My father would have had something to say about this," she said. "What do you think he would have said?" She thought about it. Probably that it was too much and that he didn't need it. And then he would have taken it and put new tile in the bathroom, which has needed new tile for 8 years. Marcus laughed. It came out of him the way laughter does when something is true. "The tile is included," he said. "I know it is," she said. "That's what I'm telling you." She put the money to work the way she said she would. A new HVAC unit for the store, tile in the bathroom, a security camera system long overdue, 3 months of operating reserve sitting in an account she did not have to think about every morning when she opened, which was its own kind of peace, the kind you do not appreciate until you have spent years without it. She hired a full-time second employee, a young woman named Brianna, who had been coming in on weekends and who was reliable in the precise way that made Denise believe she was worth investing in. She gave Brianna full hours and a small raise and a clear picture of how the station worked from the inside out. Terrell the mechanic came in 4 days a week instead of 2. He and Brianna between them knew enough about the operation that Denise could, for the first time in 3 years, take a Saturday off. She drove to see her sister in Valdosta. She stayed 2 nights. She slept. She did not tell anyone except her sister and Brianna about where the grant had come from, and even with them she kept it simple. A program, an application. Her own business standing on its own merit, receiving what it had earned. That was the truth. She held to it. In October the following year she got a card in the mail, no return address she recognized, just an Atlanta postmark. Inside was a photograph printed on plain paper, a little blurry because it had been taken from a phone, of a young man in a Navy gas station vest standing behind a counter that Denise recognized immediately. The counter at the Starlight. Taken from outside the window looking in, the way a customer might glance through the glass before coming in for coffee. On the back of the photograph, in a handwriting she did not recognize, were 3 words. "Thank you, Earl." She sat at the small table near the window for a long time. The morning rush had come and gone. Brianna was stocking the coolers, the familiar clink of bottles settling into their places. The coffee burner hummed. Outside, someone pulled up to the pumps, and the bell gave its thin, tinny ring when the door opened. Denise set the photograph on the table. She smoothed its edge with her thumb. Her father had spent 12 years worrying about whether he had done right by a young man he could not quite remember. The young man had spent 12 years building something that eventually sent him 200 miles back down a country highway to find out. And the circle had closed, quietly, without ceremony, in the way that most true things close. She thought about what her father would have said about all of it. He would have said he was just doing his job, which was what he always said about the things he did that mattered most. She put the photograph in the drawer under the register where she kept the things she wanted to keep. If you have ever had someone push you out of a place that felt safe before you were ready, before you knew what was on the other side, let me ask you something. Did you find out later that they were right? Drop your answer in the comments. This channel runs on those stories, the real ones, and we have another one waiting for you right now. Brianna came up front carrying an empty box. She glanced at Denise, then at the table where the photograph had been. "Everything okay?" she asked. Denise looked out the window. The lot was quiet. The yellow awning held its familiar shape against the November sky, a little faded, a little worn, exactly where it had always been. "Everything's fine," she said. "Everything is fine." She stood up. She went back behind the counter. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the left carafe. Outside, another truck pulled in off Route 41, headlights cutting through the grey morning air, and she opened the station into another ordinary day that was not ordinary at all. Marcus Webb had not intended to become the kind of man who drove 200 miles on a Tuesday. He had become, over the past decade, precisely the kind of man who sent other people places, who authorized and delegated and reviewed, who sat at the center of a system designed to move efficiently without requiring his physical presence anywhere inconvenient. He had a board, he had a team, he had a senior vice president of operations whose entire job was to do the things Marcus used to do himself, on worse sleep and for a fraction of the pay. And yet, the thing about the Starlight was that he had never stopped thinking about it in the particular way you think about a place that shaped you before you knew you were being shaped, not every day, not even every month. It surfaced reliably at odd moments. In a conference room in Houston, watching a presentation about fuel distribution efficiency, he had looked at a map of the Southeast Corridor and felt the route pull at him the way a current pulls. In the back of a car in Charlotte, stuck in traffic, he had counted the minutes he had once spent on that country highway and tried to remember what he had been thinking about, driving to work at 5:30 in the morning at 20 years old, the world not yet decided about him. He remembered that he had been thinking about nothing in particular. He remembered the radio. He remembered that the heater in his car had not worked that winter and that he had worn his coat to drive. He was worth, at last count, slightly more than $900 million. He owned 3 planes. He still remembered the broken heater. The people in his life who knew him well would not have been entirely surprised that he had made this drive. His executive assistant, Kay, who had worked with him for 7 years, had expressed her polite puzzlement over the phone, and then rescheduled his afternoon and said nothing further, because she knew him well enough to know that when he got quiet and specific about something, it was better to make room for it than to ask too many questions. His friend Andre, who had known him since the Atlanta years, would have said immediately that this sounded like Marcus, and then offered to come along, which Marcus had not wanted. This was not something he had wanted company for. He had spent the drive down thinking about the old man, the way you think about someone you owe a debt to, someone who cannot collect it. Earl had been 60 when Marcus worked for him, a wide-shouldered man with reading glasses on a cord around his neck, and the specific kind of patience that comes from running a small business in a quiet corridor for 30 years. He was not effusive. He was not warm in the way that some bosses are warm, the practiced handshake and the remembered birthday. He was fair, which was better. He paid on time. He told you when something was wrong and did not tell you when something was right, because in his view, right was the expected baseline, and pointing at it was condescending. Marcus had respected that. He had not always liked it, but he had respected it. The firing had come on a Thursday. He had not seen it coming, which embarrassed him even now a little. He had thought he was doing well. He had thought, with the particular confidence of a 22-year-old who has been competent at something for 2 years, that he was indispensable. Earl had disabused him of this, kindly but completely, in about 4 minutes. "I think you need to be somewhere else," Earl had said. He had said it the way you say something you have decided and are not going to discuss. And then he had handed Marcus a check that included 2 extra weeks, which was more than he was legally owed, and shaken his hand, and that had been that. Marcus had sat in his car for 20 minutes before he could drive. He had been angry in the way you are angry when something has been taken from you that you are not finished with, even if you did not particularly love it. He had driven home. He had eaten cereal for dinner. He had watched television without seeing it. The 3 days alone in the apartment afterward had been the worst of it, not because of the loneliness, but because of the specific terror of not knowing what came next. He had $41, a car with a bad heater, and no clear picture of what he was qualified to do that would pay him more than slightly above minimum wage. He had a cousin in Atlanta he barely knew. He had a phone with a cracked screen. He had, somewhere under the terror, a stubbornness that had been with him since childhood and that he had never found a name for. Only a feeling, which was that he was not going to let this be the last thing that happened to him. He drove to Atlanta because $41 and a cracked phone was not enough to go anywhere else worth going. The warehouse on the eastern edge of the city took him on because they needed overnight loaders, and he showed up at 5 in the morning and was willing to work. And in this country, that combination is sometimes sufficient. He loaded boxes for 8 months, and he watched the trucks, and he talked to the drivers, and he learned the routes the way he had learned the inventory at the Starlight, methodically, because understanding the whole thing was more interesting than understanding just his part of it. The routing inefficiency had not been invisible. Several of the drivers knew about it. They talked about it in the break room the way workers talk about things that frustrate them and that they don't expect anyone to fix, with a resigned humour that covered the real annoyance. Marcus had listened to these conversations for 3 months before he sat down and worked out on the back of a paper bag what the actual cost of the inefficiency was per quarter. He had then transferred this to notebook paper because notebook paper seemed more serious. $60,000 a year conservatively. Maybe 72. The floor supervisor had looked at the notebook paper for a long time and then told Marcus to come back in the morning and talk to the shift manager. The shift manager had looked at it for an even longer time and had asked Marcus 2 very specific questions, which Marcus had answered. 3 days later, the operations director had called him in. What happened after that was the part people read about. What almost nobody wrote about was the paper bag and the notebook and the 8 months of loading boxes and the $41 and the broken heater. Those things had no glamour and they did not fit neatly into the kind of story people like to tell about success, which preferred to start a little later when the shape was already visible. Marcus had no particular interest in correcting the record. He was not given to public sentiment about his own history. The past was what it was, and the work was what it was, and the money was what it was. And he had learned early that the men who talked most about where they came from were usually the ones least certain of where they were going. He thought about that on the drive home from Decatur. He thought about Earl sitting in the back office with a private worry nobody had named until now. He thought about Denise, who had her father's directness and her own particular brand of courage, the kind that is quiet and consistent and does not ask to be noticed. He stopped for gas in a small town 20 miles north of Macon. He pumped his own fuel. He went inside and poured himself coffee from a machine that was not as good as the Starlight's left carafe, and paid a woman behind the counter who had the same look Denise had, the look of someone who had been there since early and expected to stay there until late. And he thanked her, and he meant it, and he went back to the car. The last hour of the drive was quiet. He thought about $60,000. He thought about how much that number had meant at 22. As an abstraction in a notebook, and how much it meant now as a material fact that could land in someone's account and do real work. He thought about the things Denise had said about the coolers and the part-time employees and the mornings she opened alone, and he thought about what 3 months of operating reserve felt like to someone who had never had it. The way the ground feels different under your feet when you stop being afraid, it will give. He was not going to call his CFO about this tonight. He was going to sleep on it and make sure the impulse was clean, not just the clean feeling of wanting to do something good, but the clean feeling of doing something that was actually right, which are not always the same thing. He had learned to make that distinction slowly, and he held to it. By the time the Atlanta skyline appeared in the distance, a low smear of light above the tree line, he had made the decision not to give anything to Denise. To make sure she had access to the thing that could make the decision for him correctly, which was the program. which existed for exactly these businesses, and which he trusted to evaluate her on her own merits without his thumb on the scale. She had merits. He had seen them in 45 minutes. Earl had built something that could be kept, and she was keeping it. And that was its own kind of gift, the kind that deserved to be seen. He parked in his own garage and took the elevator up and stood in his kitchen for a while in the dark. The apartment was large and well appointed and had a view that people commented on, and he stood in it and thought about a break room in a warehouse where men had talked about wasted miles with the resigned humour of people who expected nothing to change. He was glad something had changed. He was glad he had made that drive. He poured a glass of water and went to bed. The call from his attorney came on a Wednesday morning in late November, 3 weeks after Marcus had submitted his recusal letter to the grant committee. The attorney had questions about language in the application, standard language, nothing that required Marcus's attention specifically, but he had been copied on the email chain, and so he read through it anyway, sitting at his desk in Atlanta, the city arranged in its familiar geometry outside the window. The application was 15 pages. Denise had written it herself. He could tell from the syntax, the way certain sentences had the weight of someone who was used to making the case for things that should not have needed a case made. She described the Starlight's operating history over the past 6 years, the revenue figures, the community function, the number of accounts the station served. She described the infrastructure gaps without dramatizing them. She described what the money would do and in what order and why each item had been prioritized over others. She did not describe her father. She did not mention that Earl had given 12 years of his life to a place that needed him, that he had stayed when the big chains came in down the highway and the margins got thin, that he had carried a small private debt to a 22-year-old whose name he could not quite remember. None of that was relevant to the application. She knew what was relevant, and she included it, and she left out the rest. Marcus read it twice. He forwarded the attorney's questions to his legal team with instructions to handle it without his further involvement, and he put the application out of his mind. It was not his to decide. He went back to work. There was always work. A board meeting in Chicago the following week, a site visit in Tampa the week after, a series of calls with the team in Charlotte that had been running long because one of the regional managers had a habit of over-explaining the obvious, and Marcus had not yet found the right moment to address it. He addressed it, carefully on a Thursday call, and the next call ran 20 minutes shorter. He was satisfied by this the way he was always satisfied by small efficiency corrections, a quiet pleasure that had nothing to do with ego and everything to do with the sense that time was a finite thing, and wasting it was a specific kind of disrespect. He thought about Earl and time. Earl had spent his time in a particular way, bounded and local and specific to a square mile of Georgia highway, and he had done it for 30 years without apparent restlessness. Marcus had spent his time expanding in every direction available to him, and he had done that with a relentlessness that had cost him certain things he did not enumerate publicly. Not a marriage, not quite, though there had been a relationship in his early 30s that had not survived the fourth expansion. Not his health, which was good. Something harder to name. The thing where you look up and the room is full of people who want something from you and you cannot immediately remember the last conversation you had where nobody wanted anything. He had Kay. He had Andre. He had a small number of people he trusted completely and a larger number of people he worked with well, and he had learned to know the difference and be grateful for the first category even when it was small. He called Andre the week before Thanksgiving and they had dinner at a place in Midtown that Andre liked, and Marcus told him about the drive. Andre listened the way he always listened, which was completely. "You went 200 miles to thank a dead man," Andre said when Marcus finished. "I went to close something," Marcus said. "And did you?" "Partially." Andre turned his glass in his hands. "What's the other part?" "Still in process," Marcus said. Andre nodded. He did not push. This was one of the things Marcus valued about him, that he understood the difference between a question that deserved an immediate answer and one that deserved time, and he never confused them. "How was the coffee?" Andre asked. "Better than it should be," Marcus said. They ate and talked about other things, and Marcus drove home in the November dark feeling the particular peace that comes from being known by someone without condition, which is rarer than money and considerably harder to build. The grant committee met in February. They reviewed 47 applications from businesses across Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, and the Florida Panhandle. The Starlight application was in the middle of the stack numerically, and it stood out, Marcus's CFO told him afterward, because it was so unassuming. Most applicants oversold. Most described their businesses in the language of aspiration. Denise had described hers in the language of fact, which in the committee's experience was either a sign of deep confidence or a sign that someone had nothing to prove. They read it as the first kind. They voted to approve it unanimously. The CFO sent Marcus a note, brief and professional, informing him of the committee's decision. Marcus read it and replied with 2 words. Good choice. He went for a run that evening, 5 miles along the river path, and he thought about his father who had worked in a sorting facility for 31 years and who had told Marcus once that the most important thing you could do for another person was get out of the way of what they were capable of. His father had said it about parenting. Marcus had understood it to be about everything. He had gotten out of the way. The committee had done its job. Denise would get the money and decide what to do with it. What she did with it would be her own and would belong to the Starlight, and to Earl's memory, and to Route 41, and to whatever came after, none of which Marcus was a part of. He was glad anyway. He ran the last mile faster than the first 4 and arrived back at his building a little breathless and warmer than the November air warranted, and he stood on the sidewalk for a minute, cooling down, watching the city arrange itself around him. A cab pulled by. A couple walked past, arm in arm, the woman laughing at something the man had said. From somewhere down the block came the smell of a restaurant's exhaust fan, something with onions and something sweet. And Marcus stood with it for a moment, the city going about its ordinary evening, and he felt a gratitude for the ordinary that he was not always capable of feeling, but that visited him sometimes, cleanly, when something had been properly closed. He went inside. He called his mother, who was in Florida, and who would ask him if he had eaten, and he had, and he told her so, and she did not believe him, and they talked for 40 minutes about everything and nothing, and when he hung up, he sat for a while in the quiet apartment and looked at the city through the window. 12 years was not so long when you held it against the full length of a life. 12 years was enough to build something that mattered, and enough to forget why you started, and enough to find your way back if you were the kind of person who could not leave something unclosed. Marcus was that kind of person. He had always been that kind of person. Earl had known it, Marcus thought. Maybe not consciously, maybe not in words. The man had looked at a 22-year-old with $41 and a broken heater and had decided that keeping him was not the kindest thing to do. That was not the action of a man who failed to see what was in front of him. That was the action of a man who saw and who trusted what he saw, and who did what seemed right without being able to explain it clearly and without knowing how it would end. Kindness does not always look like warmth, Marcus thought. Sometimes it looks like a door closed firmly, and a cheque for 2 extra weeks, and 4 words. I think you need to be somewhere else. He had needed to be somewhere else. He had gone there, and now he had come back. Not to reclaim anything, not to measure the distance, but to say what was true, that it had mattered, that it still mattered, that the closed door had been a beginning and he had not forgotten it, and that the man who had closed it deserved to know. He could not tell Earl. He had told Denise instead, and Denise carried it now. And she would carry it the way her father had carried his small private worry, which is to say, quietly and without performance, in the back of a drawer under the register, where the things worth keeping go. That, Marcus decided, was enough. That was exactly enough. Outside, Route 41 ran on through the Georgia dark, carrying whoever it carried toward wherever they were going, the way it always had.